Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation, to our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website. Would ask our guests here in-house to check that cell phones have been turned off as a courtesy to our presenters. We will, of course, post the program on our homepage for everyone's future reference following today's presentation. And our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Following our initial presentation, Brian Riley, our J. Van Andel Senior Policy Analyst in Trade Policy, will lead our discussion further on the Jones Act versus free trade. Introducing our special guest and keynote speaker today is my colleague Walter Lohman, Director of our Asian Studies Center. Walter?
Great. Thank you, Joe. Thank you. Thank you for coming out. So you might be wondering how the Asia guy gets the responsibility of introducing our keynote speaker today. Aside from the fact that Jim DeMint, our president's unavailable, he'd be here to do the honors of introducing his former colleague, if he could, if he was available, but he's not. But I'm here because a lifetime ago, in the Coolidge administration, as we have established on the way over here, I once worked for John McCain. I'm not going to go into any long introduction about his career, 2 presidential runs, 5 terms in the Senate, incoming chairman of the Armed Services Committee, his very distinguished military service. Everyone's very well aware of all of those things. You know him, and you know that there's almost no issue that he is not involved in Washington. Indeed, no issue that he's not leading on in some way or another. I knew that very well as a staffer for him, trying to keep up with him on every new thing that came up. I just want to say, by way of introduction, that in the 6 years that I worked for John McCain in the Senate and on the presidential campaigns, I was always very proud of that fact and grateful for the opportunity to work for him. And that's because he's really a man of principle. I have to say, you may not always agree with his principles, and he develops his position according to his own conscience. But agree with him or not, you always know exactly where John McCain stands. And nowhere is that more true than on free trade. Like my boss here at the Heritage Foundation, Senator DeMint, Senator McCain is a committed, consistent, unabashed supporter of free trade. And while Jim DeMint and John McCain are very different types of guys, very different in terms of style, neither one of them was elected, and neither one of them became, and Jim DeMint didn't become president of Heritage Foundation to go along to get along. Which brings us to the Jones Act. The Jones Act is a perfect example, I think, of entrenched special interests, protectionists, really, in Washington rigging the trade game against consumers, first and foremost. Senator McCain has led the charge against it. I'm very eager to hear what he has to say. So let me turn it over to John. We'll have about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. Thank you. Senator?
Well, thank you very much, Walter. Walter failed to mention that when he first worked for me during the Coolidge administration, he was one of the first to go to Betty Ford's, and he's doing very well since an occasional slip. But anyway, thank all of you for being here. I'm very happy to be at what I have always view as a premier institution for thinking, for innovation, for strategy, to stimulate our side of the debate and provide us with the much needed information and knowledge as we take on these various issues. I know of no organization better than the Heritage Foundation, and I'm always pleased for the opportunity to come back. And by the way, this issue of the Jones Act, every once in a while I get into these issues that nobody really, if I walked down the street in Phoenix and said Jones Act, I doubt I could find a Phoenician that said, oh yeah, I know what yesterday I joined with Senator Blumenthal of Connecticut on a thing called the FANS Act. You know what the FANS Act is? You can't black out an NFL football game if you are playing football in a taxpayer-provided stadium. Why in the world should we force people excuse me, why should we not allow people to see an NFL football game just because they haven't sold out in a taxpayer-funded, tax-exempt? If there's a good deal that the NFL can get, they haven't thought of it yet. So anyway, that's my issue of yesterday, which brings me to free trade. I've got to say, the president, for the first time in 6 years, yesterday or the day before, said something about free trade. I'm hopeful that maybe that will be an agenda item. My friends, I am, there are very few benefits of old age, but I can tell you that I was there when the North American Free Trade Agreement was negotiated, and the change has been just dramatic. And the economies, not only of all of our states, but states like mine, has been dramatically enhanced. You go down to the border of my state and I'll show you the port of entry that's jammed. It's jammed with goods going back and forth. And by the way, it's still disgraceful that we don't allow Mexican trucks into our country, but nothing is perfect. I spoke to the Mexican finance minister one day not long ago, and he said, we Mexicans do more business with Arizona than we do with Spain. I mean, it's remarkable. And you'll see the same thing on our northern border. That would not have happened without the free trade agreement. And I cannot tell you a free trade agreement that has been consummated that wasn't good for America. Now, are there some losers? Of course, if there's protectionism, if you're protecting an industry, then of course they're going to lose if they can't compete. But who is it that profits? Who is it at the end of the day? And that's the average citizen. The average citizen that may have a lower price for whatever product that's coming into our country at a lower price. So, again, I was deeply touched that the president said that he is going to pursue free trade. Now, one of the things that we ought to try to do, and I talked to the incoming chairman of the Commerce Committee about this, because we had hearings back in the, the Roosevelt administration on the Jones Act when I was chairman of the Commerce Committee. And so this issue has been around for a long time. It was a law enacted in the 1920s, and it was to somehow to protect particularly ships that were moving around the Great Lakes in the 1920s. And it requires, as you know, all goods that are shipped between waterborne ports of the United States be carried by vessels built in the United States and owned and operated by Americans. Do you know the cost it is to build a ship in some foreign country versus the cost to build a ship in the United States of America? And do you know why it's dramatically more expensive in the United States of America? Because they have a captive audience. Because if you want to build a ship if you want to operate in the United States of America, you got to build a ship in the United States of America, and you got to man it with heavily unionized group, God bless them, that increases costs to an incredible degree. I've got a couple of numbers here that will probably astound you. Again, the law, actually, by the way, this came to being in the first Congress of the United States, so protectionism is not a new MO in the Congress. And then again in 1817, and again later on in the 17 and 1800s, but really the 1920s Act is what we really want to focus on today. Laws like that have led some rationale behind it when it was in the 1920s, perhaps. But it only serves to raise shipping costs and making U.S. farmers less competitive and increasing costs for Americans if American goods have to be carried on these ships, which are much higher cost to operate. It's not rocket science, as we often say. An economic study in 2002, which is the last one we could dig up, from the International Trade Commission, suggests that a repeal of the Jones Act would lower shipping costs by 22%. The same commission found that repealing the Jones Act would have an annual positive effect on the economy of $656 million. Since those studies are the most recent, imagine a repeal of the Jones Act that would be far more than $656 million annual positive welfare, probably close to $1 billion. The Jones Act also add a real direct cost to those in need. For example, the Cargo Preference Act of 1954 requires that at least 50% of all U.S. government food aid be transported on privately owned U.S. flag commercial vessels, all right? Prior to 2012, that requirement was 75% until it was amended down to 50%, okay? According to the administration's analysis, over the 2-year period the cargo preference requirement will reduce, ocean transportation costs for the Food for Peace program was reduced by an average of nearly 30%. So what does that mean? Food for Peace program is we get food to hungry people all over the world, okay? It has to be transported by ship. Now, if that shipping cost is 34% higher than it would be if you put it on a foreign ship and Congress appropriates X amount of dollars, then you are spending an unnecessary amount of money on the transportation of that aid to that country. So you are really depriving people who we are trying to help because of a law that is absolutely protectionist to an incredible degree. According to USAID, the impact of this legislation, if we increased it back to 75%, would cost over $75 million annually, and that is in the Coast Guard bill, believe it or not. You know, it's the old thing about, what was Ronald Reagan, you know, the closest thing to, what is it, eternal life is a government program. So now we're not only trying to raise it back up to 75%. I'll stop in just a minute, but I remind you, I'll just conclude. The irony of the act that it's often cited as necessary in times of emergency, but what happens after almost every emergency determination? The governors of the affected state asked for a waiver from the Jones Act after Hurricane Sandy, Katrina, and Rita. We saw it after many winter storms. This February, after a brutal winter storm that hit the Northeast, state officials in New Jersey had run out of road salt and were unable to treat the roads when they were prevented from transporting 40,000 tons of salt by cargo ship that the state had purchased from a facility in Maine. Why? There was no U.S. flag vessels to carry it. Remarkable. Anyway, so, and the other thing is our cruise ships, of course. At the Port of Seattle every year, thousands of travelers leave Seattle's cruise ship terminal headed for Alaska, and because the ships that carry the passengers are not compliant with the Passenger Services Act, which is the counterpart to the Jones Act, these passengers are required to, guess what? Get off in Canada and then get back on again to get to Alaska. I'm not making that up. And so how many customs people are required in Seattle in order to clear them to stop in Canada in order to go to Alaska? So, you know, it's your government at work. So anyway, in 2010, after the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, 21 countries offered aid, 17 countries offered aid after Katrina, okay? Several European nations offered assistance from vessels and crews with experience in removing oil spill debris. The Jones Act, those vessels were not permitted in U.S. waters when they were needed most. I rest my case. And I'm ready for any questions or comments.
I have a microphone for you if you could just identify yourself. Right here, right here.
And by the way, I'd be, since you're bored with the Jones Act, I'd be glad to answer any questions on any subject.
Thank you, Senator. It's Stephen Duffield. Used to work for your colleague, Senator Kyle. Quick question. Oftentimes, and you've been working on this for so long, you'll hear such a big pushback on this from the defense industry. Oh, I'm sorry, the Pentagon, And they're talking about shipbuilding capacity and making sure there's a strong shipbuilding capacity. And since you've worked so much on procurement issues in general and trying to make sure we don't have cronyism problems in that world, I thought you might have some thoughts on how that argument should play when talking about the Jones Act.
You know, one thing we know is that whenever there was a period in the 1980s when there was enormous consolidation in the defense industry, as you know. Major aspects of the defense industry joined together. And that's why they have 3 or 4 names now, you know. And what has happened, particularly in the shipbuilding industry, that for many of the different kinds of ships, there is no competition. So I think one of the things that we have to do in the Armed Services Committee now is to look and see if there's other aspects of the industrial base where we could, for example, do we have to always have these Gerald R. Ford class aircraft carriers? Could we have some competition for maybe some smaller carriers? Is it necessary to have the world's biggest anymore? Or is presence still one of the primary effects of sea power? So we have to, I think, look in a very innovative way at new ways to engender competition. Wherever there is competition, we see costs down. And when we see this consolidation, we see costs go up. Now, I understand why there's a reason for a certain amount of consolidation in any industry. But when you are the only game in town, like Newport News Shipbuilding is, where it's the only place that builds our aircraft carriers, my friends, the Gerald R. Ford was supposed to cost $10 billion. That's what the Congress and the American people were told. It ended up with a $2.4 billion cost overrun. And it's still going on. I can't go back to Arizona and tell my constituents who could solve all of our state's problems for years with $2.4 billion that it is justified to have that kind of cost overrun. F-35 is another example. It's replete with examples. So one of the things we need to look at, one, is absolute fixed cost contracts. And second, because you know the game now. The game now is you lowball the cost, knowing full well that you can add cost all along after you've gotten the contract, fixed cost contract. Is anyone here who has a roof leak that would give the repairman a cost plus contract? Well, anyway, and we got to try to foster competition. Now, I'm not a big fan of the littoral combat ship, but at least there's competition there. At least there's some competition between 2 different kinds of littoral combat ships, and that's what we need. That's what we need to do. But we also, finally, could I just say a thing? Maybe we should hold people responsible. You know the answer I get from the Pentagon all the time? Everybody's responsible, so nobody's responsible. That's not acceptable. Yes? No.
We'll come back to you next. You get the last word.
Hi. Senator, I'm Bob Vastine. I used to work in the Republican Conference for John Chafee, and knew you then.
A true gentleman.
A true gentleman. What you're doing is so bold and astounding. I've been in trade policy since the Kennedy round in 1965. Maritime has been untouchable and through the Kennedy round, through the Tokyo round, through the Uruguay round, through the Doha round, through 15 bilateral trade agreements and regional agreements. We've never been able to approach the issues raised by the Jones Act. And we've been asked again and again, and we've paid because we have not been able to offer that, which other countries want. We haven't gotten from them what we could get. So it's weakened our negotiating position. So what you're doing is just amazing. I've never known anybody to take this on. And you're characteristically bold, and you're to be applauded. And I really appreciate the Heritage Foundation for doing this. It's really amazing.
And always non-controversial, as you know. I thank you, and we really do have to address this issue. And, could I just I'm sorry for the long answer, but we're humanitarian. When there is a crisis in the world, who's the first to respond? The United States of America. Thank God. Whether it be in Bhopal, or whether it be the Ebola crisis, or wherever, a famine, wherever it is, we're there. Well, how do you justify having 30% of the value of whatever we're trying to deliver eaten up because of some arcane ancient law that restricts how we deliver that humanitarian aid to wherever it's needed. It's contradictory to the traditions and values of the United States of America, in my view. Yes.
Emily Meredith from Oil Daily, and my question...
From Oregon?
Oil Daily, not from Oregon. But my question
I'm glad
is...
you're not from Oregon. They're playing
Probably be a
University
little
of
grumpier if I
Arizona.
were.
They're playing the University of Arizona tonight, and they're going to get their asses kicked. So, anyway.
Still not from Oregon.
Maybe you should move there.
Then this would make more sense. My question is more practical, and that's just sort of in terms of reform of the Jones Act, if there's any particular reason you have to be optimistic about getting some reforms through, if there is anything that this could go along with, that there does seem to be, sort of more universal support for.
It's one of these things that you just keep after and propose amendments to bills and encourage hearings, and sooner or later, the dam breaks. But I have to tell you, and I think Walter would agree, and I think we just heard, the power of this maritime lobby is as powerful as anybody or organization I have run up against in my political career. So all I can do is, you got to appeal to the patron saint of lost causes and just keep pressing and keep pressing, and sooner or later, then you have to succeed. But to give up, then is an abrogation, in my view, of your responsibilities. My responsibility to my taxpayers is to do whatever I can to make their lives better. And this does not make their lives better when we waste hundreds of millions of their taxpayers' dollars.
Hi, I'm Kevin Diaradna from the Heritage Foundation. In discussing repealing the Jones Act, it makes me think of the airline and trucking deregulations that were pursued several decades ago. How do you think repealing the Jones Act compares to those reforms? And if those reforms were so feasible, why does repealing the Jones Act seem so difficult?
I am not aware of which one should. If it's airline regulation, I'm not sure which regulation you're referring to.
The airline deregulations that were pursued in the late 70s and 80s.
I think airline deregulation with some, there's always bumps in the road, but I think it's been the greatest thing for consumers. I think that opening the gates for competition as much as we possibly could was a great step forward. The dramatic expansion in airline travel. These startup airlines, many of them later got merged and all that, and there's certain consolidation that goes on. But overall, the amount of money I pay for an airline ticket from, we used to be prohibited from Washington Reagan. We used to have to go out to Dulles. It took me 10 years to bust that one up. And is probably about 1/4 of what I was paying before airline deregulation, and I'll bet you that I have at least 10 more flights a day going in to the Phoenix airport. And so I'm a great believer in not only deregulation, but I also have to say these latest mergers are concerning. The American U.S. Air, that's a pretty big, that's getting close in my mind to the edge. By the way, I was going through Reagan Airport the other day, and a guy ran up to me and said, "Say, anybody ever tell you look a lot like Senator John McCain?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Doesn't it sometimes make you mad as hell?"
We have a microphone for you. Gotta get you back soon.
Hello, Senator. Letitia Argini, retired attorney, U.S. Coast Guard. I've been studying the Jones Act for a very long time. In fact, I'm studying it now. It's very, very complicated. Every aspect is different. The U.S. built, U.S. manned, U.S. Crewed, all of it. I encourage all of you to look at every aspect of it, get your minds together, and find out how various aspects of reform, because the competition is not just the maritime, it's all of transportation sectors, and all of the various sectors has various aspects that help it get buoyed, not just the maritime side. So when you look at maritime, it's not just them. But my question to you is, Senator, is how do you keep the mariners proficient? I think the first question that you had with defense was a worthy question. You know, that's part of the argument is how do you keep the industry proficient? You know, another question is how do you keep the mariners proficient? Thank you.
Well, I think you can put in regulations and requirements for any vessel that sails in American waters has to have certain qualifications of their crew and certain standards of their equipment. I don't think that would be too difficult. And I agree with you that there are some complexities to it, but I think the answer is repeal it and then start over and do whatever regulating. And as much as I don't like government regulators, I do believe that the maritime authorities in this country could have the kind of talent and expertise to do that. Could I just do one more? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Senator. Larry Luxner, news editor of the Washington Diplomat. It seems that the Jones Act is putting a particular strain on the economy of Puerto Rico, which already is suffering a severe fiscal crisis, as you know. Given that Puerto Rico, as a U.S. Commonwealth, has no real clout on the Hill, as a state of similar size and population would have, what kind of political pressure do you think the island realistically could put on Congress to get the Jones Act repealed? Thank you.
It's Puerto Rico, Alaska, and Hawaii are the three major states that suffer from this because the cost, obviously, of transport of goods and services to their states, which is primarily by sea. So I'd like to tell you that, boy, we're going to go back tomorrow and I'm going to have an amendment on the defense authorization bill and we're going to repeal it. It's not going to happen. We just have to keep working at it and pinging at it. And one thing is, frankly, one of the reasons why I'm here is the Heritage Foundation is very well respected in the circles that I travel in that it is known for reform, for good government, for efficiencies, and this is kind of a megaphone that we need to use to try to get the attention of members in Congress and the American people. There's, I don't know how many states on the East Coast that are border on water, and there are three, as I recall my geography on the West Coast, and, well, Alaska also, so you'd say four, but, and those, maybe the industries in those West Coast and East Coast states are powerful, but what about the other 40-some or whatever it is? Aren't they interested in seeing less expensive goods and services in their states than what they're experiencing now because of this legislation? So, frankly, I'm here because I believe that Heritage can be an important voice in getting the attention in a myriad of issues of the people that can have an influence on national security policy. So, can I say thanks, it's great to be back, and Walter, it's wonderful to see you. A lot of us didn't think you'd make it this far, and I appreciate, again, being with you today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for coming. I'm Brian Riley, and in the interest of time, I'm going to just dive right into our panelists. and provide some short introductions that really give short shrift to their qualifications. We're going to start in the middle of our panel with Gary Huffbauer. Gary is from the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and I'm just going to sum up and say Gary is one of the country's most knowledgeable and respected trade experts, and we're glad to have him here today. Then we're going to go to my left with Charles Drevna. Mr. Drevna is president of the American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers Association. His association represents more than 400 companies that encompass virtually all U.S. refining and petrochemical manufacturing. He actually was called out by name at a recent forum by the chairman of the American Maritime Partnership for questioning the Jones Act. And then we'll hear from Brian Slattery, my colleague at the Heritage Foundation. He's research associate for Defense and Security Studies in the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign and National Security Policy here at the Heritage Foundation, and then hope to have some time for questions from the audience. So, Gary, with that, I will let you kick things off.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to pick up on the point that Bob Vastine so ably made. We have a very strong comparative advantage in this country in several products, but two sectors, notably agriculture and services. And the numbers are there for the imports and exports of these two. And we're particularly strong in services, where our exports are almost 700 billion, imports about 460 billion. But we have these sacred cows, as Bob Vastine pointed out, that really hinder our ability to negotiate trade agreements, and have done for decades. So in agriculture, they're pretty well known, and they're still there: sugar, dairy, peanuts. In services, the Jones Act takes almost pride of place, but we also have heavy restrictions on insurance and TV, radio, cable. With global free trade in services, which I know is a distant proposition, but as Senator McCain said, we have to think beyond today. We could increase our exports by about 300 billion. I mean, it would be a big increase. And these numbers, Brad Jensen has documented this for anybody who's interested. But as long as we have this Jones Act and these other sacred cows, I mean, again, as Bob Vastine, who's quite experienced as a negotiator, pointed out, it's really hard to get other countries to liberalize. In fact, it's not possible to the extent we would like. So here is just a chart of some ad valorem tariff equivalent barriers, and there's been a great deal of econometric work done on this in the last, I would say, decade. And there are a couple of ways of looking at barriers to services trade, which is not nearly as easy as barriers to goods trade. We can just look at the tariff, but for services trade, it takes a lot of indirect studies. But there have been three very good studies, one by the World Bank, one by the OECD, and then one by CEPI, a French institute, which backed out numbers from a gravity model. And the coincidence is very strong between these studies, so three independent studies. We think we have a general fix on the height of these barriers. You can just scan this table. You see U.S. has its services barriers, for sure, across the various sectors. Transit is, what we're talking about here, but it also covers airlines, where we have a similar type of cabotage arrangement in the air industry. But if you just look at it, U.S. is generally lower than the other major countries in barriers. Hong Kong is obviously a lot lower than the U.S., and in some sectors, Singapore is quite a bit lower. But again, very high barriers to services trade in the world, and that's reflected in the low amount of services trade. Even I quoted the numbers, but compared to the amount of services activity, trade is much smaller than it could be, and the U.S. could be a huge exporter across these if we could get some meaningful liberalization. Now, we have maritime. And the senator said it very well. I mean, this is the world's oldest infant industry. And as Senator McCain said, you know, back in 1789, we had a discriminatory tonnage tax, higher on foreign tonnage coming into U.S. ports than on U.S. Ships coming into U.S. ports. The cabotage law, 1817, repealed in World War I, renewed as the Jones Act, which we know and love today. And it's buttressed, as the senator said, by various cargo preference laws. The national security argument is often made and was raised this morning. And my short answer to this is if it's in the national security, that's the Pentagon's business. Pentagon thinks it wants to subsidize ships. It should go in and subsidize to its, you know, that's how it makes its decision. And if this is more important than other forms of you know, battleships, carriers, or aircraft or whatever, by all means do it. They are the experts on national security. I mean, that's what we pay them for, and we pay them a lot. When the industry comes and says, you know, we're helping national security, then we have to be very skeptical, and I am obviously very skeptical. So, just my last slide on this. You know, there are people who criticize those of us who are in favor of freer trade, and one of them is Denise Krepp, who is a married veteran, and she has an op-ed which has this language. And she singled out Cato and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Chicago Council and USAID for being amongst those who don't recognize the importance of the Jones Act and cargo preference. But I feel very amiss that she did not mention the Peterson Institute. We published a study back in '86, which dealt with this. We did it again in 1994. She didn't mention heritage either. She needs to increase her list of folk who are amongst those who don't see the virtues of the Jones Act. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gary. We've had a revolution in energy in the United States. Our colleague, my colleague Nick Loris, has written a lot about that for the Heritage Foundation, and it has brought the Jones Act into play for U.S. industries, and that's why we asked Charlie Drebner to join us this afternoon.
Thank you so much, and it's great to be here. I know you could be some Q&A later on, but let me ask you a question first. You know, and I didn't think of this. It came from another organization, but I think it hits home directly. How much more economically self-destructive can policy be than a federal statute that consigns U.S. businesses to inefficient production and transportation options, deters investment in U.S. manufacturing distribution operations, and really gives carte blanche to shipbuilders to be unresponsive to customer needs as they and their unions desire? So that's the question for you to answer. So we could spend a lot of time. I really appreciate the senator's comments. They were absolutely right on. He stole a lot of my stuff, but that's okay. No, really. I mean, we could talk about try to explain that archaic Jones Act, but the real takeaway, ladies and gentlemen, is the expiration date on the Jones Act is long, long overdue. Any discussion about economically incoherent policies must include the egregious Jones Act, which now 94 years, it was going on a century. It's controlled how commodities, as we all know, are transported. Now, I'm just going to touch really briefly on the defense side, and you're absolutely right about let the Pentagon do it, but and we'll talk more about defense later. But today, we sell jet fighters and other military hardware to foreign nations. We buy components of ships and planes from foreign producers and foreign defense contractors. We even use Russian-built rocket engines that sometimes even don't explode after liftoff. So this whole thing about, as Gary mentioned, about this has to be, for national defense. Well, if our national defense and national security this great nation is predicated on goods being transported between U.S. ports on U.S.-built ships, U.S.-owned and manned, then I would suggest we're in a lot deeper trouble than we know. So whatever the sense the Jones Act may have made decades ago, it really no longer applies. But, the law is here in the law, and it includes refiners, and we're in it, and ultimately the American consumer, as Senator McCain pointed out. Now, yet my members in the refining industry for so long, the consequences of the Jones Act, we just put it under, well, that's the doggone cost of doing business, and the thing is, though, that cost continues to rise, not for oil and gasoline, but for all goods consumed in the United States. So this is not new. So why is there particular interest to my industry? Well, a funny thing happened in the last, United States over the course of the last 7 or 8 years. The shale revolution has really launched the nation's trajectory towards North American energy independence, as well as being a recognized global leader in energy and manufacturing. So as U.S. production has increased, so too have waterborne movements of crude and oil, helping to relieve some of the bottlenecks caused by really an infrastructure that has to be rebuilt in pipelines throughout the country. The waterborne movement is on Jones Act vessels, which have become even more costly to use because increasing demand for certified tankers and barges that unfortunately come up against that number that aren't there. They're shrinking. The total Jones Act fleet is shrinking, not increasing. But the Jones Act may be even more damaging regionally. And this situation derives from the growing, the talk about let's lift the restrictions on crude oil exports, rightly categorized as lifting a barrier to free trade. So several years ago, we had some East Coast refiners, which were located in the Philadelphia, Delaware Valley River area, faced closure due to rising feedstock costs, i.e. they were married to foreign crude oil of the Brent quality, mostly from Nigeria. And in late 2011, 2 domestic refineries in the Philadelphia area closed. Another one was going to be closed if you couldn't find, during the summer of 12, if you couldn't find a buyer. The 3 East Coast refineries that were at risk represented over half of the refining capacity on the East Coast. So at that time, they were paying maybe $3.50 more per barrel than their Gulf Coast competitors. We can remember now the Gulf Coast provides 25 to 30% of the finished product in the Northeast. So, but they could still, the other refiners could still handle it up because of those transportation costs. In 2012, that jumped to $7 a barrel, and they just can't do business at that kind of disparity. Ultimately, a couple of last-minute buyouts saved those refineries. 3 did close in the Caribbean, a couple other East Coast refineries. So, what happened was, due to the Bakken crude from North Dakota being able to get to Philadelphia area and as other refineries, that differential shrunk back to where they would be competitive again. So opening the door to crude exports will increase the cost to East Coast refiners. This is where the Jones Act comes in. The East Coast guys are in a unique position that they are a direct foreigners or direct competitors to Canada, which mostly I don't consider to be foreign country except our president does. With the Keystone Pipeline or lack of it, and then shipments of gasoline coming in from Europe. So visualize this, okay? You have 2 ships. One's a Jones Act ship, one's a foreign flag vessel. They both have identical volumes of the same crude oil, domestic crude oil. They both leave the Gulf Coast at the same time. Now, this is not an algebra question. This is one of those. So the ships go up around the Gulf, up the East Coast, and the Jones Act vessel stays along the coast and goes into the ports in Philadelphia. The non-Jones Act vessel makes a right turn and goes to Europe. The difference in the transportation cost for that crude oil, if you're the Jones Act ship going to Philadelphia, it's $5 to $6 per barrel of oil. If you're the non-Jones Act ship going to Europe, it's $2 to $3 per barrel of oil. So they refine it over in Europe and send the gasoline back here at about a 7 cent discount to what the East Coast refiners could do. So we're taking U.S. crude oil, not being able to give it to our consumers in the Northeast, sending it to Europe, sending it back to be used as product, and putting our refineries out of business. So, and listen, to be clear, AFPM, we believe the free market should drive American energy policy. Heck, we believe free markets should drive all policies, as Senator McClain so poignantly pointed out. But the free market doesn't exist. And if you're going to address crude oil exports, which is fine, just think, 5, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, if I was sitting here telling you, hey, let's have a discussion about crude oil exports, you'd have looked at me and said, where is, he must have been now living in Colorado or Washington where you can buy this stuff. But in any event, you can't look at this stuff in a vacuum. One free market release and keeping another thing as a free market inhibitor doesn't equal a free market. We can compete with anybody in the globe on refineries. We have the best refineries, the most sophisticated. We can compete. But, we can't do it if we have these crazy policies. So, I've always considered our energy policy, such as it is, if one can say it's an energy policy, we don't have an energy policy here. We haven't had one ever. We sort of lurch from crisis to crisis. And back in the 70s, it was, with the Arab oil embargo, our response was put on a sweater and don't put Christmas lights up. That was our energy policy. Fast forward a little bit, it was synthetic fuels are going to be the savior. So we developed this thing called the Synthetic Fuels Corporation. It was a crash program. It was successful in that it crashed. It wasn't based on any sound economics. And now fast forward to the 2000s, and now the savior is going to be renewable fuels. And the only other guy who I get more nasty grams from than the fellow at the Maritime folks is my counter associates in the ethanol industry. So we have a chance to do this right, and I hope it doesn't take 10 years. We can do it. We got to get together to do it, though. One industry is not. My industry can't do this alone. We're great at losing issues by ourselves. We need, as Senator said, we need to do this and do it right. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, the first question for the senator was about defense and security policy, so I'm happy to have Brian here to talk about our defense and security policy.
Yeah, thanks. As Brian mentioned, I'm going to talk about some of the security implications under the Jones Act. And there are 3 major points I want to address in this respect. That's disaster response efforts, support to U.S. military missions, and sustaining the Navy's fleet size. And Senator McCain already touched on the first point in terms of the Jones Act inhibiting the nation's ability to respond in times of national disaster. He specifically pointed out one of the incidents that happened this past February, the Mid-Atlantic snowstorm that occurred. And the government of New Jersey, as he pointed out, was running out of rock salt. They were unable to clear their roadways, which can be dangerous not just because it prevents people from driving to the grocery store or to the gas station, but it inhibited state and local emergency medical technicians, police officers, and firemen from doing their jobs. As he mentioned, there was a foreign vessel in the region that had a shipment of rock salt, but it was unable to come and provide the resource because of the Jones Act. Now, there's been debate, actually, about whether or not New Jersey filed the request for the Jones Act properly. That's one of the things that pro-Jones Act folks have countered with. Even that illustrates that the act is a bureaucratic roadblock during times of emergency. To give a little bit of background on this waiver process, the President or the Secretary of Homeland Security may issue a waiver to the Jones Act for, quote, in the interest of national defense. Individual vessels may be issued waivers, or the government can issue a blanket waiver during a maritime emergency so that all available assets can be cleared for use during this emergency. I just wanted to go over a few other recent examples that illustrate how the Jones Act has prevented the best disaster response from occurring. In 2012, during Hurricane Sandy, the act had to be waived so that foreign vessels could supply emergency fuel oil. In December of 2011, the Jones Act had to be waived in the community of Nome, Alaska, during a particularly heavy winter storm, so that heating oil could be provided to this community. In 2005, as many of you remember, the Bush administration issued a blanket waiver to the Jones Act for Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, so that all available assets in the region could contribute to the response effort as quickly as possible. The bottom line here is that the government should not have to hold a debate over what assets it can call upon during an incident that involves the maritime domain. The Jones Act only serves to delay or prevent the best response from happening. My second point is the issue of whether or not the Jones Act supports the U.S. during time of war. Supporters of the Act claim that the Jones Act provides additional capability to perform supply and logistics efforts during major military engagements. While this is true, the number of Jones Act vessels capable of sailing across the Pacific or the Atlantic Oceans is usually not enough. In recent engagements, the Military Sealift Command has contracted with foreign companies for vessels when the U.S. could not fulfill the mission requirements. In some cases, these foreign vessels actually improve the efficiency of the operations, as was the case in Operation Iraqi Freedom, where there are particular foreign transport vessels that were actually transporting troops more quickly than the Jones Act fleet was capable of doing. However, some people also argue that reliance on foreign-built or foreign-owned vessels is detrimental to our national security because we may not be able to call upon them during times of major military engagement. My counter to this argument is to look at what countries we have received this type of support from. We're not talking about Canada or Russia providing supplemental sea lift support to the U.S. military. Most of the nations that have supported the U.S. in such operations are treaty allies, such as Japan, Australia, Denmark, and South Korea. It's far-fetched to imagine a scenario where the U.S. requires foreign sea lift support and none of these allies are willing to come to our aid. Finally, I wanted to address the notion that the Navy's fleet would decline dramatically if we were to repeal the Jones Act. This is false for two reasons. One, the recent decline of the Navy does not correlate with that of the Jones Act fleet. If this were true, the Navy's decline would be much more damaging to national security because the Jones Act fleet has actually declined much more rapidly over the same time frame. The Heritage Foundation has never been shy in pointing out that the Navy is smaller today than it needs to be to fulfill all of its security requirements, which is why we have consistently supported a more robust naval fleet, even one larger than the Navy's own 30-year shipbuilding 30-year shipbuilding plan states. However, reversing this trend requires a more serious commitment from the President and Congress to make the necessary investments to revitalize the Navy. The Jones Act only serves as a distraction from the debate our national leaders must have each year to continue to provide for the national defense. In closing, the Jones Act does not support American security capability. It only serves to drive up costs to the economy while inhibiting the government from responding during national disasters. Thanks, and we look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Brian. So a couple of ground rules. We have microphones on both sides, so I'll recognize you and wait for a microphone because you're speaking not just to the people here in the auditorium, but to those who may be watching online. And I'd ask if you would also identify yourself and ask a question as opposed to statements. And you're welcome to provide an introductory statement, of course. And if you have a particular panelist you'd like to direct your question to, that's fine as well. Any questions? Over here.
Thank you very much. Very informative. What is Bob Vastine again? What is the core of the political opposition to changing the Jones Act and related restrictions? Is it unions? Is it the companies? What gives?
You probably know better than anybody else.
I think it's probably, it's both, it's, one of the things that I over the course of my, career in trying to either promote or get rid of laws, is that it's so much more difficult if it's a single group, it's one group focused on one thing. Where you take my industry, we've got 99,000 different issues that we've got to confront. But if you've got a single issue group that you can really a single issue pack, if you say so, that really has an entranced hold on what I believe to be the narrative. This is as again I refer to what Senator McCain talked about. He walks down the streets of Phoenix and just says Jones Act, and people go, what's going on? But I believe it's shame on us and collectively, because I do believe that once the general public really understands the ramifications of this thing, there will be a groundswell of opposition to it. You say it's the unions, but there were 2,500 to 3,000 direct union jobs that were saved in those East Coast refineries, and then there were a couple of studies that had been done that was the direct jobs, and if those refineries would have shut down, it'd be like 25 to 30,000 people out in the street looking for a job. So it's. I think it's a question of education. This thing has been in the closet for so long that no one really understands it.
Let me briefly supplement what Charlie said. If I go back to those sacred cow industries, or at least three of them, peanuts, sugar, and Jones Act, they're all quite small in terms of the number of employees. And a big argument is always, we're going to save the jobs of those people. When you cost it out, saving the jobs of those particular employees, whether it be maritime or sugar or peanut farmers, costs the American public at least $200,000 per job per year. It's quite expensive. So given that fact, which has been, I think, well documented across a range of industries, how does this persist? Well, these industries are very generous political contributors on a per industry basis. And I haven't looked at the Jones Act contributions recently, but when I looked at it a couple of decades ago in that publication cited, it was the maritime industry was amongst the top contributors to congressional, both parties, right across the board, Senate and Congress. So they could be relied upon. Same with sugar, same with peanuts, if ever threatened. And I think that kind of industry contribution makes a difference in addition to the narrative.
Agree.
Hi, John Magnus, a trade consultant here in town. It was good to hear a story about how the Jones Act is causing economic activity to happen in Europe that would otherwise happen here, gas being refined. I've heard that a similar story with regard to oil extraction and the repair work on the offshore oil platforms, because there aren't enough Jones Act qualified boats to bring them here, so that repair work happens in Europe as well. I've also heard that in the TTIP negotiations, the Europeans want us to get rid of the Jones Act. It seems like it's a good deal for them. So what explains that? Does it somehow? How do you see that in terms of the negotiating dynamic between the European Union and the United States?
Well, thanks, John. Good to see you. I believe the Jones Act was almost the first thing that Froman took off the table in the TTIP negotiations. Right away, he said, we're not going to touch the Jones Act. Finance was, I think, second after that. Now, why are the Europeans so keen on it? I think there are a couple of reasons. One, especially if we take the East Coast, a lot of European ships would come over and, they unload something in Boston, and then they've got more deliveries of the same product or some different product. These would be container ships, Maersk down in, maybe Newport News or wherever, and they've got empty capacity. And they would like to fill up that capacity, especially the container ships, maybe not so much oil, with cargo, and they can't. So that it's dead weight for them, and I think that's the main thing for Europe on the Jones Act. Canada has a similar plea with respect to the Great Lakes. I think as well, Europe spills over the same argument into which I mentioned very briefly, the airline cabotage. And their argument is, well, it's a combination of, mercantilism, we all have that, and fairness. What they point out is that U.S. airlines can, they can go to any of the countries in Europe, and they can fly between the countries, and anyway, for them it's great. But for the U.S. airlines. But for the European airlines, they can't come to New York, leave off some passengers, and then continue on to Chicago and pick up passengers in New York. So I think they also have the airline industry in mind. But I think that's also off limits. To me, that would be the strong European interest.
John Heimlich, and coincident to some of the questions, I'm with Airlines for America, so I'm enjoying some of the questions. Glad I came here just to hear those answers. So with respect to some of the comparisons, it's very relevant to my question, because I think one of the big differences has to do with the U.S. built provision for the vessels themselves. So the big difference I would make with whether it's airlines or truck or rail or anything versus maritime, of course, is that we can purchase, operate vessels built from overseas. If you could imagine Congress tomorrow saying U.S. airlines can no longer, or trains can no longer operate Bombardier from Canada, Embraer from Brazil, Airbus from Europe, that would be a major difference, and it clearly would have implications for price levels and air service and all that. So that goes to my question, which is, while many in the room would seek a full repeal of the act, it seems like the most economically powerful and perhaps more viable or pragmatic would be to focus on the U.S. built provision of the act, which I think a lot of the literature and analysis so far and the discussion has focused on the price of goods and services. And while there's clearly a strong case there, I think there might also be a strong case on an increase in U.S. jobs if we allowed an influx of these foreign-built vessels, as well as benefits to the environment related to the newness of the vessels and the distances to which they were traveling. And I wondered if, I haven't seen a large degree of analysis surrounding the potential upside for U.S. jobs and for environmental benefits that could perhaps pull in more constituents and politicians to make the case for relaxing part of the Jones.
Well, let me just briefly leap in and say I really applaud your incremental approach, because as trade negotiators, and there are several in this room, would know, oftentimes that's how you do it, bit by bit. And so, as Brian Slattery pointed out, these very powerful examples on emergency, that would be an area where you could probably get an automatic waiver. The governor just writes a letter. It doesn't have to go anyplace. He puts a note on his pad or whatever, automatic emergency. And what you just said about ships building. So bit by bit, and this would then replicate or would imitate, let me say, what, for example, was done in a much larger industry over a long period of time, and that's liberalization of clothing in the United States. At one time, it was highly protected over a 20-year period, bit by bit. It's not quite free trade, but we're much, much closer than we were when I started off in this business. So I applaud your sentiments.
Yeah, I just throw in a couple of other options in terms of the incremental approach that people have suggested to me, and I'm sure there are many more, allowing us to buy vessels built in other countries, making it easier to have foreign investment in the United States to create jobs here. I know some of my friends from Hawaii and Puerto Rico would like an exemption. They don't have railroads or trucks running from Florida to Puerto Rico. Across the country, many ports are in the process of dredging the ports to accommodate new ships that will be coming through the Panama Canal after it expands, and they might like some kind of an exemption to allow the European dredgers to compete for business. So I bet if we started a list, that yours might be number one on the list, but there'd be a lot of different ways things that we should look at in addition to just the idea it's all or nothing. I think that's a good point. I think we had a question over here and then one over here, and then we'll wrap things up.
So Letitia Argeni again. I was going to actually ask each of you if you had a particular aspect of the Jones Act that you were interested in. So I'm going to skip that then and go to another part. I've been looking at short sea shipping. I don't know if any of you have been looking at that, America's Marine Highway. Where my interest has been looking at is just, we've really been focused on post-Panamax vessels, and for those of you who may not know, the Panama Canal is widening. We have these very large vessels coming in. We have an enormous amount of freight coming in, and we need to move it. And at the same time, we have about 18 billion of these huge containers coming in, and we're putting them on trucks, and we're moving it around. And we are continuing to swell, and if you commute at all, you know what that means on our highways, and it continues to move. And we only move about 4% of our domestic products by ships, whereas in Europe they move about 30 some odd percent by ships. And I was wondering, particularly on the national security issue, and again, I come from the Coast Guard's my roots, what would you think about foreigners going up and down the Great Lakes and others, moving transportation? Would that be a concern? And had you considered that? And I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean it in a sense of the national security concerns that people had said about coming into facility sides, what sort of concerns would be, affiliated with that and not being a U.S. Merchant mariner moving that domestic trade.
Thank you. I'm going to let Brian take a stab at that. Thank you.
As Senator McCain pointed out, there are other ways that you can go about the vetting process to make sure that these individuals are people you can trust and that don't pose national security threats. So I don't think that would be a problem to manage that security risk if you removed that from some of the other provisions of the Jones Act.
Can I comment there?
Sure.
And from my industry, and coming from the Coast Guard, I hope you can appreciate this, and with the Facility Security Act, everybody comes in and out of our operations have to have a TWIC card, Transportation Worker Identification Card. And it's a cumbersome process to go through to get these folks certified, but it seems to be working. So there are ways of doing it.
Hi. This one. I'm Jim Hassick. I'm from the Atlanta Council across town, where I mostly work on national security issues. So I've got a question specifically for you, Brian. The senator was talking about, and I apologize, I'll try to keep the wind-up brief. The senator was talking about his frustration with shipbuilding, but specifically with naval shipbuilding. And you were talking about your frustration with the size of the fleet. So is what we're thinking about the Jones Act with respect to the demand that American stuff move on American bottoms, is there an analogy to the Navy? If the Air Force wants to buy a tanker, in theory, it could buy one from Airbus. And if the Army wants an armored car, it can get it from Canada, the Stryker. But the Navy is legally forbidden from buying a foreign-built ship. Do we need to revisit that in order to introduce some competition into naval shipbuilding in the U.S.?
There might be something to that, but I think it's really more a matter of national priorities. I think one of the biggest reasons that there have been troubles with reducing costs and making programs more efficient, and this is DoD-wide, this is not just respective to the U.S. Navy, but part of it is because the budget process has been very disjointed. There have been continuing resolutions and things like that make it very difficult for the Department of Defense to plan their budget accordingly. And this hurts the shipbuilding industry more than other industries, in my opinion, because these are programs that take many years in advance in development, in assessing long lead material items that they can purchase and things of that nature. And if you have a stronger discussion about more solid funding and more consistent funding then you can realize some cost savings. And an example of that would be the Virginia-class submarine program, where there was a consensus within the government that this was a national priority, and they made decisions that reduced that program's cost and have the production rate at a level that they want it to be at. That's actually been a success story within the shipbuilding program.
Well, thank you. On that note, we'll wrap up. We have sandwiches outside for those of you who are here physically, and would you join me in thanking our panelists?